Welcome to the Leading Together podcast. I'm Sean Lee, joined as always by my co-host, Joe Olwig. Joe, how's it going today?
It's going good. Happy Friday. We made it.
Happy Friday. We made it. We got some time together earlier this week. I flew to St. Louis to do some strategic planning work for the company. That's always super energizing, but like you, I'm glad Friday's here.
Yeah. Sad that our coffee shop closed.
Yeah.
Our headquarter coffee shop sadly closed
I
here in
know.
St.
We got to
Louis.
find a new coffee shop. You'd think this would be easier, but it feels like such a challenge to find the perfect space that inspires good collaborative strategic work.
Yeah.
Still on the search.
Right. Good
Awesome. Well,
stuff.
let's jump in today. And before we dive right in, we're actually going to start with a number that should stop us in our tracks as relative to this episode today.
Yeah. So according to a study in 2023 by Bain and Company, they report half of all managers believe that bureaucracy and organizational silos are actively impeding their company's growth and innovation. Think about
Wow,
that.
that's
Right?
crazy.
50% of leaders today still say silos are one of the biggest barriers holding them back.
Gosh. Right. And what's crazy about that is that after all these years, companies have been focusing on things like agility, cross functionality, and breaking down walls probably more than ever. Right. But the fact is that these silos are still showing up. They strongly tell us that there's some significant problem. It's not just a legacy problem, but there's some significant problem still going on today. And at the end of the day, they're still an active threat to growth and organizational alignment.
Yeah. So the hard truth we're going to unpack today is that silos almost always start at the top, right? With how leaders of that senior leadership team think, operate, behave, right? As that sets the tone for the entire organization. And so most times it's the root cause of the silos that you see inside the team.
Yeah. Cool. Well, and just to make sure we all understand, or our listeners and viewers on YouTube know what we're talking about when we say silos, maybe we should just start with a shared definition.
Yeah. So, when we think about the behaviors, right, and mindsets of siloed teams, it's when those teams, departments, or individuals prioritize their own goals, information, success over the broader success of the organization. And it often shows up in, limited collaboration, less effective communication, environments where priorities feel like they're competing as opposed to sort of cooperating, and ultimately decision making that really is filters for what's going to optimize for my department or my functional area, even over the organization as a whole.
Yeah. Well, and I think, as you mentioned earlier, the real issue here and the reason we're excited to talk about this topic today is that silos almost always start at the top of the organization, right? And so often without realizing it, leadership teams are fueling the problem. There's some irony here because those leadership teams are often also the very same people who are longing for cross-department collaboration throughout the rest of the organization, right? Not realizing what they're modeling.
Yeah. So unless teams lead differently with more intentionality, unless they adopt what we refer to as an org first mindset, those silos are only going to get bigger and stronger and become seemingly unbreakable, right? And overcomable, unovercomable.
Yeah, I don't know.
We can't jump over
They're
them.
unable to be overcome. I don't know.
We're here. We want to be there, but we can't get there. Right. So that's what we're going to dive into today. Break down this idea of silos, and in pursuit of creating leadership teams where we're really embracing this org first mindset.
Great. Well, as always, we're going to unpack three big questions related to this topic. And our first question is, what do the behaviors of silo teams versus org first teams actually look like?
Yeah. So, Sean, I didn't tell you I'm going to do this, but I'm going to share sort of a list of things on one side and the other side. So, sort of show what do some of the behaviors look like on a siloed team, right, in these different contexts, and then the same on the org first team, right?
Great.
So, let's
Great.
start with in terms of mindset. On the siloed side, the mindset is what's most important is personal responsibility and individual performance. On the org first side, what's most important is organizational health and team performance. In terms of meetings, what do those look like, right? Silos, they look transactional. They look consumptive, right? Where we're just consuming information. They're narrow minded, and people are really wearing one hat, the hat of their functional area or department. On the org first side in those meetings, right? They're collaborative. They're generative, right? And in these authentic ways, they're curious, right? And people are wearing two hats, department and organization, right? Uh, and then a few others, right? And how we spend our time, only departmental work versus maybe still mostly departmental work, but significant contribution to org level priorities where they're a part of cross-functional work, right? And stewarding org level goals and priorities forward. Uh, and then lastly, sort of how we feel about the leadership team, right? So where there's siloed work, it's this sense of competitiveness, right? And sort of personal accountability and performance above anything else. Whereas on the org first side, right, there's this truly this sense of camaraderie and shared purpose above anything else. So start to paint the picture of both there. But what do
Hmm.
you think? What is help me build on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I love this list, and I think what it just makes me think from both the lens of being on leadership teams and then all the teams we support is that until teams actively step into doing some of the work of like really accepting and well, starting with just like what is it what would it look like for us to wear these two hats, right, or even bring an org first mindset, they before they do that intentional work, the default place they end up being, right, is this like my team, my department is the default like lens they take. And so it can feel very challenging when they then step into that like different reality of now I'm on the leadership team, right? I've got to show up and behave in a different way and hold different things to be important, but we haven't really defined what those things are, right? or what the expectations of me being here are. And
Hmm.
so I wonder maybe I could share a quick story related to this. Um, and it's about a time when I was on a senior leadership team, and we were wrestling with a really difficult decision. We spent a lot of time like talking about it, and ultimately came to a decision that we were all aligned on as a group. And then we had some actions coming out of it where each of us had to go communicate this important change with the rest of the teams in the organization. And we knew, we expected there would be some pushback and some questions, and that, even though not everybody would necessarily be excited about this change, that it was ultimately in the best the best interest of the organization as a whole.
Yeah.
At least that was our calculus, right? That we were doing the best we could.
Yeah.
and,
Always.
and right. And well, one key leader of the team, sure, as we expected, that he faced some pushback and some disagreement. And in that, he said, "Well, you know what? I didn't really agree with this decision in the first place, and I'm actually agree with you, right?" And so I share this story because I think it was an example of our team at that time had not gone through the work defining what the expectations are. We just
Yeah.
kind of assumed that maybe we had some of the shared expectations. And ultimately, that leader felt a stronger sense of identity and connection to those departments and work that he was doing, right? And much stronger than he did with us as a leadership team.
Yeah.
And so when those two things came into conflict, he went, with what he had known for like most of his
Yeah.
career. I think for most people, like,
Yeah.
that's a feeling that we can probably relate to.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know the audience right now is can relate to that because we've seen that happen, right? And I think I like how you're assuming the best of the leader in that case, right? And you're continuing to bring our values, see the potential, see the possibility, right? Ultimately, a lot of times when we get into that place, we're not quite aware of how impactful that moment is in
Mm,
terms of furthering silos, right? It's almost like the moment they say, I disagreed and I don't really, we're like digging the trench a little bit deeper, right?
mm,
To
mm,
set up the silo, and we're not even aware of it because most likely we've been there. That was that was a complex scenario, right? You're thinking about all of these different things related to managing your team and leading your team and continuing to build the rapport, and maybe you've got these leaders who are questioning your leadership in different ways, so you're just doing everything you can to sort of strengthen at that level without fully understanding the impact of that. But to go back to what you talked, I think a lot of times we just don't recognize how important it is, right, to respond with an org first mindset in that moment.
yeah,
And because we haven't maybe seen it happen, it's just not clear what would it look like to model org first in that moment when we're getting that pushback.
yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think that it might look like a leader when they're facing that would remind of the overall strategy, right, or identity of the organization, and use that as the rationale for why those decisions were made or how they came to. Now, there's also some work that hopefully preceded that, where people throughout the organization were being heard and having input towards those decisions. And you could also point to that, right? You could say if that's happening, and when it's happening, well, like here are the ways in which people's voices have been considered and part of the process to get to these key decisions. But I think at the bottom line, it's like if the leadership team is clear on their overall vision, their priorities for a period of time, whether it's a year or a quarter or whatever, and they can point to those as the rationale for the decisions that were made at an org level, right? And they're aligned in repeating those things, then I think the rest of the people in the organization are beginning to understand, like, oh, like this is real. Like this isn't just like a exercise we do. Like this is the real direction we're headed. This is our true identity as an organization. And we're making decisions that support those things, right? So the work of each member of the leadership team often involves like helping everyone throughout the organization to understand that.
I love that. You're reminding me maybe of just like one last thing to add here is like um, one of the best indicators of a team really modeling that org first characteristic is the leadership team is sort of predictable to interact with if you're not on that team, because you know what you're going to get back from them is a team mindset. That leadership
Hmm.
team has cohesion. They're together, but also that they're placing the organization first, right? And so you would almost just always expect, right, not in a robotic way, right, but in a healthy way, to see and hear the leadership team modeling that cohesion, modeling that org first mentality. And so over time, you become to just expect that as other members of the organization, and it ends up being investing, right? So we're going to kind of get into this in a moment here with question two. So I'm going to pull us into question two, which is, why is leading with an org first mindset so powerful?
Well, I think one of the things that comes to mind is that an org first mindset is can be incredibly empowering, right? So it offers an invitation for the whole leadership team, and then the rest of the teams in the organization to make an impact on the most meaningful way, right? Like when everyone is aligned on these are the top level goals. This is the big vision that we are pursuing together. Like we have leveled up above just my department goals. And by clearly knowing what those are, then when I'm back doing my day-to-day work, right? Like I'm leaders will then and people throughout the organization will then make these connections where they know that
Mm,
of this partnership, like this strategic opportunity, this even just key decision, like can advance like this big org level goals and priorities that we have. So it offers in many ways a permission structure and a grand invitation to do even more important work.
yeah, I love that. What comes to mind for me with this one goes back to sort of our core belief that really guides leading together, our leading together program, which is number one driver of org effectiveness performance is a high performing leadership team. And the
Mm,
last word there is team.
mm,
And it's really hard to sort of become a team if you don't embrace org first mindset. Because if you think about it, if we don't do that, then what is the reason why we're all here?
Mm.
together in this leadership team meeting, right? In the absence of, rallying around the importance of org first, what does that look like? Well, it looks like prioritizing the organization's identity above all, right? Bringing priorities at the org level forward and really being champions of those, right? And so it's once we get there that we start to see, oh, this is a team. We have a common reason for coming together. We have a shared purpose, but in the absence of that, you show up to those meetings and you really do feel like, why am I here? Other than just reporting out my actual team's work. And in that case, this could have came through an email, right? So it's almost like you're not going to be able to become a cohesive leadership team. You're not going to actually even feel like a team if you can't embrace this org first mindset, right? So it's sort of a requirement, and then you think about the team beginning to have shared purpose and the impact of that on the organization's identity, on those goals, on being a shared steward of culture and performance.
Hmm.
um, and you start to see those things begin to take off.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
love that. I mean, I hear you. Cohesion is one of the six levers in the framework that we created, and so obviously we believe in the power of cohesion, both as sort of a aspirational objective and as just something that needs to be continually worked on, right? And there's lots of different ways you can do that, and also just you're taking me back, Joe, to stuff we've talked about previous episodes, but just kind of what's the makeup or what are the characteristics of high performing teams, and some of them, what we when you get beyond some of the foundational stuff of like trust and psychological safety, high performing teams that are very cohesive do have a shared sense of purpose, right? And that shared sense of purpose is what I'm hearing you say is, well, that's one of the key ingredients that's ultimately going to help bring us together, right? Because there is just like I think a lot of what we're talking about is there's a lot of organizational forces that are working against this happening, right? There's the day-to-day work. My job description says I have to do all these things, right? Like all my tasks on my to-do list are sort of feel like they're often working against this, right? And so how do we stack the deck the other way to pull us back to the work that we think matters more,
Above
right?
everything. Yeah.
Certainly at least as much, but hopefully if you're on the senior leadership team more, right? Because who else is going to be stewarding all this forward? How do we begin to get pulled back into that? And what I'm hearing you say is like, well, step one is like let's develop let's define our shared purpose together so that we can rally around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and if you're not convinced, not that that's what we're trying to do, but I want to add one more thing here, which is the big when it comes to like driving big strategic priorities and initiatives forward in effective ways and realizing those outcomes that we want to realize. It's going to require the leadership team to come together to collaboratively and collectively own those initiatives, right? Maybe it won't require everyone's involvement to the same degree, but if we're thinking about big scale change within our organization, or big improvements and growth in certain areas, that's going to require cross functional work. And oftentimes we get to those places where we have this vision to do X, Y, or Z, and when we go to roll it out, it's the one person on the leadership team who's going to be the steward of
Hmm.
it, right?
Yeah,
And they're going to sort of be out on an island trying to, and then we sort of say, well, we can't, what we can't do that, or this type of stuff doesn't work. Well,
mm,
it doesn't work because we haven't created this culture of org first, where we've built some muscle around what it looks like to come together and own priorities,
yeah,
together. And so
yeah,
there's also just this very sort of tactical, structural piece to this, that when we build a muscle around org first, we're more capable, right, of driving that big work forward.
yeah. I love that, Joe. And you're reminding me of just maybe one final point here is that when we increasingly do this and embrace this lens of org first over my team first, or the silo mentality, it creates organizational resiliency, right? So, and you even just said it, like we see it with organizations all the time, especially when we first start working with them, is that all too often it's just like one to two key people on the leadership team. Maybe it's the CEO and one other key person who have that ultimate responsibility, and the rest of the team doesn't really feel it. And so when that happens, like when one of those key leaders exits, it's incredibly disruptive, right? Because there are only one or two people who've been carrying this like org level view,
Yeah,
and now it's like we don't even know how to do that, right? So if you get the whole team doing it, a lot more org resiliency.
love that. Love that. All right, question three. You ready for it?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. So, why is this shift so difficult for leadership teams?
Well, we've kind of been beginning to talk about this already a bit today, and I think at a very basic level, it's because members of the leadership team have not defined what the core expectations are of being a healthy member of that leadership team, right? Like it's clear what their job function is as the leader of the sales department or the program department or the finance department, right? They know that. But we sort of, most teams, it's like taken for granted what those expectations are. And so it, an answer to that would be or a starting place would be just to get together and answer questions like this, or just talk and have dialogue about questions like this. Ultimately, what are we responsible for? How will we develop and engage with strategy as a team, right? Like as a team, and how will we collectively monitor and take ownership of our finances as a team? How will we know if our people throughout the organization are engaged, and how do we all take responsibility for that, right? And probably most importantly, how important are all those things to us, right? And I say that this last part because um, what we have seen, unfortunately, with too many organizations is they might say that's important, but their actions often show otherwise.
Hmm.
And what we mean by that is like when they get to busy seasons, they this work gets put to the wayside.
Hmm.
Like and you're right, they go to focus on the urgent work
Yeah.
that's right in front of them, the firefighting, and they can not meet as a team for 4 weeks, and they can skip a quarterly prioritization, right? Because all this urgent stuff is facing them. So that's a signal we think of team that, well, clearly they don't view that work as important as it should be, or they haven't taken the time to align. So this is kind of a starting point. Like we first need to start by defining what are the expectations of even being a healthy leadership team member.
Yeah. Well, I think you're helping to paint a solid picture of why it's hard to make the shift and what we can do about it. And I think when teams don't do that, when that's not true, when the norms and the expectations and the cultural components, right, about that leadership team haven't been defined and embraced, think about the new leader who joins the team when that's not true and what that experience is like. Because as you walk down that road, right, what you think about is I'm new to the team. I've been assigned, I've got a job description. I've got goals. I'm hardwired to know within the world of work, I need to be accountable to my results. I need to sort of prove myself on the team, right? There's no culture around teamship or shared purpose, so I don't see anything else to do but go go do my work, right? And do
Hmm.
it really,
Hmm.
really well. And
Hmm.
so just instantly, we are just furthering that siloed work and the gap that
Hmm.
exists between silos, and org first teams. Because right from the get-go, we are just yeah, we're seeing the conditions that exist. We're responding to them in rational, logical ways, right? And we're as a result going to prioritize my functional area, my department, above anything else.
Yeah, sure, that's great, and it just reminds me of I think so often the default place that people go with their time and best thinking is the ways that they've been formed and kind of what their core identity as an individual is,
Yeah.
right? So that that looks like if I've been a CPA my whole career, and I've had a few promotions, but I've gone from controller to now CFO, and I'm I know that work and I have deep expertise in it, that I'm, in a world where what it means for me to now be a member of the leadership team has not been defined, I'm going to go back to like what feels like my core work identity, right? So for many of us, like we just have this core work identity and our training expertise, and we don't have all of that development and formation of what it means to be a member of the leadership team. So our default position, it's just easy to go back to the other one, right? And so yeah, it takes really a mindset of like as an individual, I have an evolving identity, right? I have an identity that continues to be that. Like I'm still an expert in finance, but I'm also a member of the leadership team, and that's a really meaningful, important part of my identity now.
Yeah, that's great. Love that. Well, we want to wrap up here.
Yeah, let's go ahead as always, let's talk about what's one move leadership teams can make this week to start leading org first.
Yeah. Sean, for this one, I think one of the common sort of evergreen coaching points that we bring to teams is asking them sort of the question of, what would the ideal outcome or the change in practice look like, and help them to first align on what that new standard would look like, um, and do that, by the way, collaboratively. Have them support you in setting the standard. D'Amico Ryans, right? He loves doing
Hmm.
that. Um, but in this case, specifically related to what does it mean to be org first to this team? And two, what are some of those foundational team norms and expectations to bring some clarity to being a leadership team member, right? Oftentimes we just don't, as we pointed out, we don't know what that looks like, or we haven't defined what that means, right? And so in this case, okay, let's align on what the more ideal outcome and set of behaviors and practices would look like in those two lanes of org first and the role of a leadership team member. And this you can really think of as the start to sort of a team charter, right? So you might think about this as the first thing that you do to begin documenting some of those core qualities, aspects, characteristics of your leadership team, and it sort of begins to serve as a bit of a compass for your team as you operate together.
Yeah. Joe, I love that. And maybe one thing just to add to this the step that folks can take is that I think there are many cases where the process is just as bit as important as the outcome. And as I was hearing you say this, it just made me think like yes, having clarity like in the form of a one pager, like a little team charter, that will be really helpful and meaningful. But maybe I think we know from experience what it's probably going to be even more meaningful is them stepping back and having a dialogue and hearing from each other,
Yeah,
right? And like
absolutely. Always.
like that memory, right, of like them knowing like we did this thing where we stepped back because we viewed this as important enough, and we got to really hear and like take time to come up with what does it mean to be org first for us, and what are foundational expectations of leadership team meeting. They're gonna remember that experience and that conversation, especially if it's kind of new for a team, and that the experience can go a long way to driving cohesion just as much as like having the artifact to reference later.
Love that. So important to call that piece of it out. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, as always, thanks for tuning into this episode of Leading Together. If you found it valuable, be sure to like, subscribe, leave a review. It helps more leadership teams to discover these conversations. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment with your thoughts, and you can always find more resources at sixlevers.co. Until next time, remember to take that one step toward becoming a more cohesive leadership team.